Our next panelist is going to be talking about some of the risks of the energy transition that we've been talking about today. Bob Martin is the Managing Director of Christie 55 Solutions. Bob is a senior executive with vast experience in both public and private sectors, working and running large and complex organizations. Prior to joining his current employer, Bob was a partner at Accenture LLP with over 25 years experience, and more importantly, from my perspective, he was my boss at DEP for 8 years. So I welcome Bob to this podium.
Well, it's wonderful to see everybody here today, and a lot of familiar faces, and a lot of people that I've worked for, that have worked for me, that have worked together with. And so thank you for having me here today, NJBIA. And thank you, NJBIA, for what you do and your leadership in the state. Michelle and Ray, you guys do a great job in getting out in front of a lot of critical issues across for multiple industries, multiple businesses, and for consumers. So thank you for what you do for the state overall. Today, I want to focus on kind of a narrow slice, but a macro view of a narrow slice of some of the challenges that are going on that we're going to face with energy transition in the U.S. and globally overall. I mean, there's kind of a couple of schools of thought here where people seem to think everything's wonderful and this is going to be easy to go do from an energy transition point of view. And then there's another group that's thinking along the path, this is going to be so darn hard, we're not going to get there or find the obstacles around that. I'm going to present more of a pragmatic and realistic view of how and what we're going to need to do to address some of these challenges going forward in the industry. And I take it through the two lenses. First is the kind of the net zero targets that are being set both on a national scale and international scale. And I think that's important because those are going to be public policy and political environments that are going to drive all this. The second lens, I would suggest, is probably just as important, if not more important, when policymakers are making decisions, and that's going to be around energy security. Energy security is going to be critical as you decide and manage through this transition. Let me see, what do I got here? First, let me talk about energy security. I mean, recent history has shown us the fragile nature of the environment we're dealing with from an energy world right now. I mean, that nature driven by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, to most recently this weekend with Hamas invading Israel. We're going to see challenges like that. They're going to force changes in the global markets that happen with oil and other commodities going forward. The definition as would be defined, everyone pretty much accepts anyway, what is energy security? It's the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. That's how countries would view it. That's how nations would view it moving forward. And one of the key things that people always kind of confuse, energy independence at the same time, is that equals energy security. The answer, it doesn't. Having energy independence is one thing, because that could be one fuel or a couple of fuels, but what you need is a portfolio of energy to be able to drive any economy going forward and to protect yourself from energy security. One of the most important things the U.S. has, which I think we need to make sure we continue to recognize, is the U.S. has vast resources, whether you're talking about oil and natural gas, you're talking about wind, you're talking about solar, or you're talking about nuclear technology that we have. So there's a lot of different components that we're fortunate to have. I just use that as the context to what I want to talk about and continue to put the pieces together. Okay, there we go. I'm going to frame out several facts around energy, and before I get into the challenges and the risk of managing those. Fact one, the first set of facts deal with basically what we're looking at is today, the energy situation today. If you look at it now, 79% of the energy that's consumed in this country right now is fossil-based. We could talk about as much as we want, and we know we're optimistic about renewables, and we need to make sure those drive forward. But the reality is we're at 13% today. on the renewable front. A smaller share is in, if you look at, on the nuclear front, which is disappointing on when you start to figure out where we need to go, both renewables and go forward with nuclear. We've got to change that scale long term. But I present that as kind of fact number one we've got to deal with in the reality. Fact two we need to face going forward is looking at what this demand is going to be like going forward, not just over the next few years, but over the next several decades, and moving forward over the next 100 years. Demand and consumption of petroleum products will continue to rise still out to 2050. That's the targets from the Energy Information Agency or Administration right now. They've laid out those targets already, showing that that demand is still going to increase even while we drive very quickly with renewables in this country. But the fastest growing component will be renewables. We know that, just based on what the investments are today and the investments we expect in the future and public policy that's driving it going forward. Again, part of the challenge with that and what's going to make that happen at the same time, public policy, new technologies, and the market will continue to drive what's going forward. Again, the statement of looking out to 2050, this is not my data, this is the federal government's data, looking out on what those projections are. While it slows on the fossil fuels, but they still continue to grow in the market as the market demand grows for energy, that will still continue to grow. What the good news is the rate of growth on renewables starts to pick up pretty significantly and continues on well into the end of this century. Fact three, kind of working from the base of information and the context of all this, is around electricity plant closures in the U.S. They've been going down dramatically over the last decade, and they're planned to continue on through the end of this decade and beyond. Now, that's not bad when you start removing coal and you start replacing it with renewables. That's the good news. The tough news is that we're not ready to make sure we can replace that. The battery storage technology is there. While wind is rapidly growing, solar is rapidly growing, we need to figure out how to fill that gap going forward. But right now, there's plans based on data that's out there. 173 coal plants will be closing over the next 7 years. That we ought to be concerned about, because that is the base load that keeps the lights on in the country overall and creates, when we have challenges with intermittent resources that we need to stabilize in the future. But right now, we need to make sure that we're focused on this. Fact number four, we have an aging infrastructure in this country, especially for the electric grid itself. And if you look at the 600,000 miles of the transmission infrastructure in this country, we're looking at a lot of that technology goes back to the 1950s and 1960s on the structure and design and engineering around that. You also look at right now, you look at 70% of the transmission and large grid transformers are over 25 years old. The average age of that infrastructure overall is 40 years old. Again, think about the technology that's advanced in this country over this period of time in the last 40 years. That is tremendous. You're not dealing with the kinds of digital technology that need to be there. The bottom line is the grid needs to be massively modernized and upgraded, especially as we talk about electrifying the overall infrastructure in this country going forward. It's a critical aspect. Fact number five, the cost of this transition, there will be a cost to this transition. Again, we can debate how much it is and what it is. There's a lot of different numbers out there. I'm sure Professor Jensen and others will have some of those going, will show us some of that. But bottom line is, the numbers are big. You're talking about trillions of dollars across the globe that need to be invested. We're talking upwards to 1% of GDP as we get out to 2050. Which means we're starting to look at numbers that start to look like $2 trillion investments from the U.S. and whether it's private sector or government. Those investments need to be made going forward. Not making a decision or not judging what that means at the end of the day in this part of the discussion. But the bottom line is there is a cost. We need to recognize that cost. And the last fact I want to set out first is around critical minerals and components for renewables. You've heard several panels talk about that already. But the reality is that if we're going to talk about renewable energy, we're going to need multiple different types of critical minerals that we don't control here in the U.S. And that's a factor to it. So we're going to be subject to others and other countries on when we get materials, how we get them, or do we get them at all. That certainly could help stifle some of the growth of renewables as we go forward. Some of the critical numbers on here that we certainly ought to be very concerned about, when you look at some of the, like 80% production of tungsten, 60% indium comes from China, 70% of the rare earths are produced in China itself. 50% of the rare earths are controlled by either Russia or China together. They combine 50%. 80% of the solar panels are built and produced and shipped out of China. So again, not making it a China discussion or China debate, those are the kinds of numbers we need at a macro scale, need to understand, and how those impact the U.S. and the global market going forward for renewables. Let me shift over now to the transition. When we talk about the transition and the risk around this transition of energy going forward. I would argue there are 5 key points, and I'm sure we could probably add another 10 in this room with everybody, but I'm going to argue there are 5 key risks we need to manage going forward. And again, back through the lens of zero carbon, zero carbons going forward, and also through the lens of national and energy security. The first one is we can't ignore the realities, the energy needs for the next several decades. That was my point before. We need to make sure we've got enough energy going forward and we meet those needs. We can't underestimate that, and I'll talk about that in a second and how we minimize that. The second one, we need to invest in the energy infrastructure to be able to provide the reliability, resiliency going forward, and to complete our full portfolio of energy going forward. That investment needs to be made in the infrastructure. And that's in the grid itself, the electric grid, but also we cannot ignore the fact that we need pipelines for natural gas and oil that need to be maintained or enhanced to provide energy looking out over the next 50 to 100 years. That's not going away. We need that infrastructure still there going forward. Number 3 issue is the affordability of energy. We need to look at the cost. I mentioned the cost a few minutes ago. They're going to be expensive. But we need to make sure that we're having an honest debate about those, a transparency around those costs going forward. If not, I would argue they may end up stifling some of the growth we want to see in renewables going forward. I think we need to push forward. We need to push it in a lot of ways, but we also need to be transparent about that cost going forward. Number 4, ignoring the needs for long-term planning and supply chains and critical minerals may slow down the growth of renewables in the future. Again, back to my point, we don't control those, someone else will control them. They'll either drive up the cost or make it just not palatable to be able to drive forward with renewables going forward. We need to have both the supply chain, critical minerals, we need to own those, we need to produce those, and we can't be dependent on someone else, especially if they're not an ally to the United States. The last one I would suggest overall is that we can't afford the early closure of base load electricity in this country. We need to make sure it's there until we get a reliable transition to renewable energy. As I said, renewable energy is coming, but we need to make sure we do not cut ourselves short around base load electricity, especially at the same time we're trying to electrify the overall country at the same time. States are driving there, the federal government's driving there, and it's just a reality. Whether public policy does it or not, the market will drive it from an electricity point of view. That's going to be significant in the future. Let me quickly talk about each one of these risks. Risk number one, again, talking about that energy, the energy we're going to need for the next several decades. We're going to need first to minimize those risks. We got to have to make sure we continue to make significant investments in renewables, both in the private sector and the public sector, to keep this moving forward. I talked earlier on about the issues and the markets, the global markets that get affected by events like Russia, like Hamas, like other events in the Middle East that change the price of oil. That volatility we can't get away from until we have other supplies, both here in the U.S., with all kinds of energy, but especially when we start moving to renewables. That starts to take that volatility away in the United States and around the world. We need to recommit investments in fossil fuels, natural gas, and petroleum as necessary to continue to grow. Again, looking at the targets that are going out in the future, we can't ignore that. U.S. has that abundance. We need to make sure we're making those investments at the same time as we have and grow the renewable base that we have in this country. Again, we saw the panel talking about nuclear. Strong advocate of nuclear. I believe it's one of the right fuels we need to have in the country and around the world. When you start talking about carbon-free investments, we should be focused on that as well. The SMR technology is obviously the new platform to be able to move those quickly and less expensively and a lot less risk going forward. And again, new technologies play into this as well. I mean, green hydrogen is gigantic in that space. We need to think about carbon sequestration, fusion, all the rest need to play new technologies going forward. The second risk, and to manage that second risk that I talked about, when we talk about infrastructure, again, without a reliable grid that's out there, we are not going to be able to grow a lot of the full portfolio that we have and need in this country unless we figure that out. Again, we need to recognize that both the electric grid and pipelines in this country are critical infrastructure. They need to be treated that way. They need to be invested in that way. They need to be maintained, and we need to continue driving investments in that going forward. It's interesting because the biggest driver of a modernized grid is going to be renewables. We need a grid that's upgraded for that. As you just look around the country, whether it's solar, it's onshore wind, it's offshore wind, we need grid upgrades to make those work at the end of the day, and we're going to have to make those investments to make it happen. Again, there's going to be investments in the grid overall, and I think the couple other key pieces I would mention on that, when you look at players like FERC, the RTOs, the ISOs, they need to play a key role in that going forward. The last argument I would also add to this is that NEPA. The changes in NEPA that were recently done to the National Environmental Protection Act, that changes were critical. There's still more changes that need to be made. Until we do that, the ability to hold up, whether it's a renewable project or it's a fossil project, will continue. And that big fight continues now in the courts. Will continue in the courts unless that part of the law is fixed and needs to be fixed forward. I'd love to talk about this all day because I think it's broken. I think NEPA is critical to this country, and as former DEP commissioner, certainly truly believe in it and what it says, but at the same time, when something is used to stop progress in the right areas when they meet the law, I think those things need to be addressed at a grand scale. Risk number 3, ignoring the affordability, I think will have unintentional consequences, and that does worry me. We need to talk about those costs going forward. We need to have realistic projections of what those costs are to the U.S. economy and to consumers. We need to be transparent about that cost. We need to talk about it. We need to understand, what the costs are, who's going to pay for it, and how we're going to pay for it. We can't ignore that discussion. And I'm not talking about anywhere specifically on a state or otherwise. On an overall scale as a country, we need to talk about those costs, and globally we should talk about those costs because those are still not being addressed I don't think even on a global scale. And then again, we need to put those into context around a net zero balancing that with the cost to consumers. So there needs to be a balancing act that needs to occur around this. Risk number 4, we talked about the critical materials and supply chain. I mean, managing those risks are pretty obvious, right? We need to make sure that we can diversify the supply chain around that. We can diversify the manufacturing around that. And the U.S. needs to make sure that we set public policy around the ability to both produce those materials and manufacture those materials. And yes, I'm suggesting we should be mining more. If we're going to continue on the path that we need those critical minerals for going forward, then we're going to need to mine those here in the U.S., and we need to drive that in through our public policy. If renewables are critical, which we say they are, then we need to make sure we have the materials available to be able to do that job right and move forward with it. And again, the last piece of it is, you know, we have a lot of global allies and partners who control a lot of these minerals as well. Those alliances should be even tighter than ever if we're going to make sure they're available, and we continue to do that. The last risk I want to talk about is also the one we talked about, the base load electricity, and not losing that base load going forward. We need to make sure that we ensure base load is in place until reliable, till we have reliable transition to renewables. And that should be phased in over a long period of time. Let's not just set goals of shutting down plants without knowing what's going to replace it going forward. And it's got to be crystal clear. What is it and what's not going to be there in place? Again, you know, the RTOs and ISOs need to play into this discussion. The other point that I would probably make very adamantly is that public policy and political decisions can't just decide this at the end of the day. They can't override realistic engineering pieces of this. And yes, I'm suggesting a PJM, yes, they're the experts. Those are the kinds of experts we need to have in place that help us decide these public policy decisions, because they're the ones watching what needs to be produced, where does it need to go, and how do we get electricity to the right places over a longer period of time. So we need to make sure we've got the adults in the room when we talk about planning out and how we're going to close plants and move forward with the overall economy of this country, because it will affect the overall economy. And again, there needs to be overall cooperation between the ISOs, the RTOs, the regulators need to be a critical portion of this and a key part of this discussion going forward, along with the industry overall. My last slide, just restating all those things I just talked about a few minutes ago. But again, I would probably just close with the last words that, you know, energy security does equate to national security. And, you know, I put an article out there back in April that framed around a lot of these concepts, and glad to share that, because I think it is extremely important that we view this in the context of U.S. national security and how we move forward, while we continue to drive forward, you know, with, you know, kind of net zero targets, and we continue to drive forward with renewables. Thank you very much.